Do you know which ride goes to
Do
this
you know which
cemetery?
ride goes to this cemetery?
Annie asked urgently, though she still tried to sound polite.
She stood near
the entrance to Birmingham's intermodal facility.
One arm wrapped tightly around a bouquet of white daisies carefully covered in clear plastic. With her other hand, she held out a sheet of paper folded into quarters, its edges softened from being handled so often. The man who had just stepped out of the black SUV was Richard Whitmore. He glanced at Annie but did not look at the paper in her hand. Behind them, travelers hurried past pulling suitcases. Some carried cups of hot coffee, while others checked their watches as they walked. A bus stood at the curb, its engine idling steadily in the morning sunlight. "You should ask one of the employees inside," Richard said. "They know the routes better than I do." He turned to leave. "I already asked them, sir." Annie's voice made him stop, though he did not turn around immediately. She moved closer, carefully keeping the bouquet from brushing against the people passing between them. "They said I have to take 2 buses," Annie explained, "but I don't know where to get off to make the transfer. They wrote down the route numbers for me, but I've never gone there alone before." Richard checked his watch. He had come to the station only to collect a box of family documents that a relative had sent from Nashville. His driver was waiting beside the SUV, and his assistant had already called twice to remind him that Nathan Caldwell and a team of attorneys were waiting at his downtown office. Richard turned back toward her. "Call your family," he said. "Ask someone to pick you up." Annie lowered the paper. "My grandmother is the only person who usually comes with me." "Then call her. She's sick." Her answer was so quiet that the sound of the idling engine behind them nearly drowned it out. Richard studied her more closely. Annie's face was very young, but exhaustion showed clearly in her eyes. Her coat was clean, though the cuffs were frayed and the zipper no longer closed completely. The white daisies had been arranged neatly, but the plastic was torn near the bottom and repaired with a strip of clear tape. "She couldn't get out of bed today," Annie continued. "Her knees hurt so badly that she can't stand for long. The doctor also told her not to walk too far." She looked down at the paper in her hand. "I told her I could go by myself, but you don't know the way." Annie pressed her lips together. "I thought I remembered." Richard's phone rang. He looked at the name on the screen. "Linda Hayes." He answered. "What is it?" "Mr. Whitmore, everyone from Caldwell's team is here," Linda said. Her voice remained calm, but the tension was unmistakable. "The legal team has another meeting at 10, and Nathan says he won't postpone the presentation again. I'm picking up the package. You were supposed to be back 15 minutes ago. Tell them to review the financial projections first. They need you to decide on the access road proposal." Richard looked across the street. His driver was still waiting beside the SUV with one hand holding the door open. "I'll be there soon. Mr. Whitmore." Richard ended the call. Annie immediately stepped back. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't realize you were so busy." She pulled the bouquet closer to her chest. "I didn't mean to take up your time." Richard slipped the phone into his coat pocket. "Why are you going to the cemetery?" Annie looked down at the white daisies. "To visit my mother." Something in the way she answered kept Richard from walking away. "When did she pass?" "1 year ago today." Annie's hand tightened slightly around the bouquet, making the plastic crinkle. "I promised I would bring her white daisies. They were her favorite." She paused before continuing. "My grandmother always came with me before. We took 2 buses, but I never paid attention to where we had to get off. I just followed her. Whenever we reached the transfer stop, she would touch my arm and say, 'Annie, it's time to get off.'" Richard looked at the paper she was holding. "Which cemetery?" Annie immediately raised the paper again. Richard still did not take it. "What's it called?" "Pine Hill Memorial Cemetery." His expression changed almost imperceptibly. It was only a brief pause, but Annie noticed. "Do you know it?" Only then did Richard look at the paper in her hand. "Pine Hill isn't close to the main bus route," he said. "You still have a long walk from the nearest stop. That's what the station employee told me. And you're still planning to go?" "If I have to walk, I will. It could take almost an hour." Annie looked toward the row of buses. "I just need to get there before noon." "Why before noon?" She was silent for several seconds. "My mother passed a few minutes after 12. Her voice slowed. "My grandmother said we should be at her grave before then. That way, she won't have to wait alone." Richard's phone rang again. This time, he did not take it out. Annie unfolded the paper herself, smoothed the creases, and held it where he could read it. "Pine Hill Memorial Cemetery. Block B, Row 7, Plot 14. Richard's gaze stopped on the final line. He knew that cemetery. He knew Block B, the 7th row, and the narrow path that passed a stone bench before reaching the last line of graves. Plot 14 was Emily's grave. More than 10 years earlier, Richard had gone there once after her funeral. He had placed a bouquet on the freshly turned soil and left before the groundskeeper closed the gate. He had never returned. "Are you certain this is the correct plot number?" Richard asked. "Yes, sir. Your mother is buried there?" "Right beside it." Richard looked up. Beside whose grave? A woman named Emily Whitmore. A bus slowly pulled away from the station. The sound of its tires rolling over the pavement mixed with the voices around them. But Richard no longer noticed any of it. "How did your mother know Emily?" "My mother took care of her when she was sick." Richard stared at Annie without blinking. "She took care of her?" "My mother worked in the laundry department at a hospital back then," Annie said. "She met Emily during one of her appointments. Emily lived alone. So my mother would bring her food, remind her to take her medicine, and help wash her clothes." "Was your mother a nurse?" "No." Annie shook her head. "She just said no one should have to be alone when they're sick." The words made Richard lower his eyes. Annie did not notice the change in his expression. She looked down at the paper and continued. "After my mother died, my grandmother told me that she had asked to be buried beside Emily. She said they had stayed beside each other during the hardest years of their lives." A bitter taste rose in Richard's throat. A poor black woman had worked long shifts at the hospital and still found time to bring Emily food and medicine. Meanwhile, Richard, the man who had once promised never to leave her, had spent his time at dinners, meeting with investors, and pursuing million-dollar contracts. As Emily grew weaker, Richard had continued telling himself that he still had time to return. That woman had done everything a husband should have done. His phone rang for the 3rd time. Richard took it out. Linda's name appeared on the screen. He turned the phone off. Annie slowly folded the paper. "I'll find another way," she said. "Thank you for stopping." She turned toward the station entrance. "Wait." She stopped and looked back. Richard held out his hand for the paper. After a moment of hesitation, Annie gave it to him. He read the address once more and then returned the paper to her. "There isn't a bus that can get you there before noon." The light faded from Annie's eyes. She lowered her gaze to the white daisies, trying to hide her disappointment. "Then I'll take the next one," she said. "I can get off at the last stop and walk." "You won't make it in time." "I'll walk fast. It's a long way from the stop to the cemetery." Annie tightened her grip on the paper. "I promised my mother." Her voice caught, but she quickly turned her face away, unwilling to let a stranger see that she was close to tears. "A year ago, I was too late. By the time I ran into the hospital, my mother was no longer conscious. I don't want to be late again today." Richard watched her for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and took out his car keys. "You don't need to take the bus." Annie looked at the keys in his hand, then at the black SUV. "What do you mean?" "I'll take you to Pine Hill." She stood frozen. "You'll take me there?" "Yes. But what about your meeting?" Richard looked toward the road leading south, toward the grave he had avoided for more than 10 years. "They've waited for me before. Why would you do this for me?" Richard looked at the white daisies in her arms. "Because I should have gone to Pine Hill a long time ago." Annie did not move right away. She looked at the keys in Richard's hand, then at the black SUV parked near the curb. A flicker of hesitation appeared in her tired eyes. "I don't want you to miss something important because of me." Instead of handing the keys to his driver as he normally would, Richard walked over and opened the passenger door himself. "The meeting can be rescheduled, but you just said a lot of people were waiting." "They're paid to wait." The answer came out with the coldness of habit. Annie lowered her head slightly, tightening her arm around the bouquet. Richard realized that he had made her feel as though she had become a burden. He softened his voice. "What I mean is, they can begin without me. You have somewhere you need to be before noon." Annie looked at him but still did not get into the vehicle. "Are you really sure?" "No," Richard answered honestly. "But get in." His honesty made her trust him more than any easy reassurance could have. She quietly thanked him and climbed into the passenger seat. Before closing the door, she carefully laid the white daisies across her knees and adjusted each stem so the delicate petals would not be crushed by the seatbelt. Richard turned to his driver. "Go inside, collect the package, and take it straight to Linda at the office." The driver looked surprised. "You're driving yourself, sir?" "Yes." The man glanced at Annie. The young woman sat almost curled into the wide leather seat, holding the bouquet with both hands as though it were the most precious thing she had. Should I tell Miss Hayes where you're going? Tell her I'll call when I need to. Richard walked around the front of the SUV and climbed into the driver's seat. As the engine started, Annie fastened her seatbelt and slipped the paper with the address into the outer pocket of her coat, where the cuffs had already begun to fray. She checked the pocket twice, as though one careless movement might make her lose the only path that could lead her back to her mother. The station gradually disappeared behind them as Richard turned onto Morris Avenue. Morning traffic was beginning to thicken, but the cars were still moving. Delivery trucks stopped in front of restaurants, office workers hurried across the street, and a city bus pulled away from a crowded platform with nearly every seat occupied. Annie turned and watched the bus through the window. That might have been the first one I needed. Even if you had caught it, you would still have needed to transfer to another bus. I know. Her voice was very quiet. She continued watching until the bus disappeared behind a row of buildings. Richard glanced at her. Were you really planning to walk from the last stop to the cemetery? My grandmother said it wasn't very far. It's farther than she remembers. She hasn't been there in months. Why not? Annie looked down at the white daisies and used the tip of one finger to free a petal pressed against the plastic. Her knees have gotten worse since my mother died. Some mornings she can still walk around the apartment by herself. But on other days, she has to call me to help her get from the bedroom to the kitchen. Is anyone staying with her while you're out? Mrs. Bell lives across the hall from us. She has a key and promised to check on her. I left her medicine and a thermos of warm water beside the bed. Richard nodded slightly. He did not understand why knowing that Annie's grandmother was not completely alone made him feel relieved. But it did. His phone remained turned off in the compartment between the seats. Although the screen was dark, Richard could still picture Linda checking the time, Nathan Caldwell growing impatient, and the attorneys repeatedly asking where he was. He reached toward the phone but stopped before touching it. Annie noticed the movement. You can call them, she said. I don't mind. But I do. She studied his profile for a moment. You don't seem like someone who often walks away from meetings. I don't. Then that cemetery must be very important to you. Richard kept his eyes on the road. It is. They drove for several more blocks without speaking. A local radio station was discussing the weekend football schedule before moving on to the traffic report. Richard lowered the volume until only the steady sound of the engine and the soft crinkling of the plastic around Annie's bouquet remained. After a while, she spoke. Were you very close to Emily? Richard's hands tightened slightly around the steering wheel. Yes. What was she like? The question caught him unprepared. For years, almost no one had asked Richard about Emily. Most people he met every day knew only about his companies, his properties, and his contracts. Very few knew that before any of those things, there had been a woman named Emily standing beside him. She was very direct, Richard said. She never pretended to agree with someone just to make them happy. Annie smiled faintly. My mother liked people like that. Emily remembered everything too. Dates, promises. Even things people had said years earlier and hoped she would forget. That sounds like my grandmother. The corner of Richard's mouth moved, but the smile disappeared before it fully formed. Annie watched the storefronts passing outside the window. My mother once said Emily rarely talked about her family. She didn't have many relatives left. Was that why she lived alone? Richard fell silent. The simple question made him feel as though Annie had touched something he had spent years burying beneath work and responsibility. No, he said at last. That wasn't why. Annie turned toward him. She could have asked another question, but she did not. Instead, she lowered her eyes and adjusted the plastic around the bouquet. Richard was grateful for her silence, yet ashamed that he needed a young woman to avoid mentioning a mistake he still lacked the courage to face. At the next intersection, traffic slowed behind a utility truck. Richard checked the clock on the dashboard. They could still reach Pine Hill before noon, but there would not be much time left if the traffic ahead became worse. Have you eaten anything? He asked. I'm fine. I didn't ask whether you were fine. Annie hesitated. I had a piece of toast. When? Early this morning. Richard glanced at her pale face, changed lanes, and turned into the drive-thru of a small diner. You don't need to buy anything for me. I'm getting coffee. But that doesn't mean I need food. No. But if I have to sit beside someone who hasn't eaten for the rest of the drive, The trip is going to become very unpleasant. Annie raised an eyebrow. Unpleasant for you or for me? For me. The answer made her laugh. It was a quiet laugh that lasted only a few seconds, but it was the first time the tension had left her face since she got into the SUV. Richard ordered a black coffee, a bottle of orange juice, and 2 egg biscuits. When he handed her the paper bag, Annie did not take it immediately. I'll pay you back. No, I can pay for it. Richard looked at her. I don't doubt that, but you're still not going to. Annie slowly accepted the bag. She opened it, took out 1 biscuit, and placed the other on the console between them. You ordered 2. 1 is for you. I didn't ask for it. Neither did I. Richard looked at the biscuit, then at Annie. She had already taken a small bite and turned toward the windshield, treating the argument as finished. At the next red light, Richard finally picked up the second biscuit. The food was warm, simple, and wrapped in paper. He could not remember the last time he had eaten a breakfast like that. His mornings usually began with meals arranged on conference tables beside documents, computers, and people who spoke almost entirely in numbers. Annie took a sip of orange juice. My mother used to bring food to people who always said they weren't hungry, she said. She told me that sometimes people refused food not because they didn't need it, but because they were afraid they had nothing to give in return. Richard kept his eyes on the road. And what did your mother do when they still refused? She put the food down and told them that if they didn't eat, she would sit there until evening. Was she always that stubborn? Most of the time. There was pride in Annie's voice, but the sadness soon returned. She ran her fingers over the plastic around the daisies, patiently smoothing a small wrinkle as though her mother would notice every detail when Annie placed the flowers on her grave. Richard folded the empty wrapper and placed it in the cup holder. Annie continued, her eyes beginning to redden. Some nights, my mother worked so late that her legs hurt too much to climb the stairs. But if she heard that Emily hadn't eaten, she would still make some soup and take it to her. I once asked why she worked so hard for someone who wasn't family. Richard did not take his eyes off the road. What did she say? She said that sometimes a stranger is the only person who chooses not to leave. If this moment touched your heart, please like this video, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories. Richard said nothing. The buildings began to thin as he moved into the lane leading toward the outskirts of the city. Did you ever go with your mother when she visited Emily? Sometimes. I was young, so I don't remember very much. Annie thought for a moment. I remember a small house, a couch with a blanket covering one side, and a very thin woman. Whenever my mother arrived, she always tried to sit up so she could thank her. Did Emily ever speak to you? One time, she showed me 2 scarves and asked which one I liked better. I chose the yellow one. Richard knew that scarf. Emily had bought it from a small shop many years earlier, when the two of them still had to count every dollar they spent. She had stood in front of the mirror for a long time and asked whether the yellow was too bright. Richard had only checked his watch and told her to hurry. She liked yellow, he said. Annie turned to look at him. You really knew her very well. Richard did not answer. He took the next exit. The city gradually fell behind them. Old neighborhoods, small churches, repair shops, and rows of pine trees appeared along both sides of the road. Annie took the directions from her coat pocket and unfolded the paper carefully so the softened edges would not tear. But Richard did not need to look at it. He knew where to turn. He knew where the road would narrow. He knew that beyond the low hill, a red brick church would appear, followed by the turn leading into Pine Hill. You said you had only been there once, Annie said. Yes, but you still remember every turn. Richard looked at the road stretching ahead. Some roads cannot be forgotten, no matter how long you try to avoid them. A green sign appeared ahead. Pine Hill Road, 2 miles. As soon as Annie saw the words, she pulled the bouquet closer. She checked the daisies one last time, then looked at the clock on the dashboard. Will we make it in time? Richard checked the time as well. We'll make it. Annie released a quiet breath. Her shoulders lowered, as though for the first time that morning, she allowed herself to believe that she could still keep the promise she had made to her mother. Richard's phone remained dark between the seats. The meeting, the attorneys, and Nathan Caldwell were still waiting somewhere behind him. Ahead lay Pine Hill Cemetery, Emily's grave, and more than 10 years of regret that Richard had tried to bury beneath his work. A few minutes after Richard passed the Pine Hill Road sign, Annie's phone vibrated inside her jacket. She checked the screen and answered at once. Hi, Grandma. Richard lowered the radio until the voices became a faint murmur. "Yes, I'm all right," Annie said. "I found someone who knows the way." She listened, then glanced at Richard. "No, I didn't get into a car with some random man." Richard turned his head slightly. Annie covered the phone with one hand. "She worries." "She should." She returned to the call. "His name is Richard Whitmore. He has a driver and everything." Richard almost corrected her by explaining that the driver was no longer with them, but decided it would not improve Ruth's opinion of the situation. Annie listened again. "Yes, ma'am. I have the flowers. They're fine. I have the paper, too." Her voice softened. "You need to take your medicine and eat something. Mrs. Bell said she would bring you oatmeal." Another pause followed. "I know what I promised." Annie looked through the windshield toward the road ahead. "We'll get there before noon." When the call ended, she kept the phone in her hand for a moment. "She wanted me to give you her full name, where we live, and Mrs. Bell's number." "That sounds reasonable." "She also wanted your license plate." Richard nodded toward the windshield. "She can have it." Annie gave him a cautious look. "Most people would be offended. Most people don't have a granddaughter accepting rides from strangers outside bus stations. You're not exactly a stranger anymore. You've known me for less than an hour. I know you buy breakfast when nobody asks, ignore phone calls from impatient people, and know the road to Pine Hill without directions. That isn't enough to trust someone." "No," Annie said, "but it's a start." Richard did not answer. The road narrowed as they left the busier part of the city. Low brick houses stood behind small yards. A man swept leaves from the steps of a barber shop. Two women arranged boxes of canned food outside a church fellowship hall. Farther ahead, an American flag moved above a volunteer fire station. Annie placed her phone in her pocket and adjusted the daisies. "My grandmother wanted to come," she said. "She put on her church dress before sunrise. Then she tried to stand and couldn't make it past the hallway." "Why the church dress?" "She always dresses properly for the cemetery." Richard glanced at her denim jacket and simple black pants. "She told me I should wear a dress, too. I told her my mother wouldn't care." "What would your mother have said?" "That the dead don't inspect your clothes." Richard let out a quiet laugh. Annie smiled, but the expression soon faded. "Grandma still set out my mother's coffee cup this morning." Richard waited. "She does that sometimes. She'll take down 2 cups without thinking. Then she notices." Annie pressed her thumb along the plastic covering the flowers. "She usually puts the second one back. Today she left it on the counter." "Grief creates habits of its own." Annie looked at him. "You sound like you know." Richard kept both hands on the wheel. "I know what it's like to avoid certain places. Is that why you never went back?" The question was direct, but not cruel. Richard watched the yellow line dividing the road. "Partly. What's the other part?" "Shame." Annie did not respond at once. "That's different from being sorry," she said. "Yes. Which one do you feel?" "Both." She considered his answer. "My mother used to say being sorry is something you feel, but making things right is something you do." She sounds like she had an answer for everything. She had an opinion about everything. That wasn't the same as having an answer. Richard smiled despite himself. Annie lifted the bouquet slightly. She liked white daisies because they were simple. She said roses looked like they were trying too hard. That also sounds like an opinion. She had strong feelings about flowers. Richard looked at the bouquet. "Did she choose the cemetery?" "My grandmother helped. There wasn't much money, and Pine Hill let them arrange payments." Reverend Brooks spoke with the manager. "Samuel Brooks?" "Yes. Do you know him?" "I met him years ago. He still preaches at New Hope." Richard knew the church. He remembered the narrow building near the cemetery road. Though he did not share that detail, Annie continued. "My mother asked to be placed beside Emily before she got too sick to make decisions. Grandma didn't understand at first. She thought my mother would want to be near our other relatives." "Why didn't she?" "She said Emily had spent too much time alone." Richard's fingers pressed harder against the steering wheel. Annie looked down at the flowers. "My mother visited Emily's grave even after she got sick. Some days she couldn't stay long, but she always cleaned around the stone. She said people stop visiting because it hurts, but then the person under the ground pays for the pain of the people still walking around." Richard said nothing. "I didn't understand that when she first said it," Annie added. "I do now." They passed a roadside produce stand with handwritten signs advertising peaches, boiled peanuts, and jars of local honey. An older man sat behind the table reading a newspaper. Richard slowed for a pickup truck turning into the lot. My mother used to buy boiled peanuts from places like that, Annie said. She would eat half the bag before we got home, then tell Grandma they didn't give her enough. Did your grandmother believe her? Never. Annie's smile returned. And this time Richard saw what grief had not erased. Grace was still present in the way Annie spoke, in the rules she remembered, and the small stories she carried. Richard had spent years refusing to speak Emily's name because it hurt. Annie spoke about Grace because silence would have hurt more. What do you do when you visit? He asked. I clean the marker. I change the flowers. Then I read something. From the Bible? Usually. My grandmother chose Psalms last time. Today I brought my mother's Bible, but I haven't decided what to read. She removed a small book from her bag. The black cover was worn at the corners, and several paper slips marked the pages. There's a note inside, Annie said. She wrote it before she passed. What does it say? Annie opened the cover but did not hand it to him. Do not let losing me make you afraid to live. Richard looked back at the road. Did it help? Some days. That's probably all advice can do. The SUV rounded a bend. A row of tall pine trees appeared beyond a low stone wall. Richard recognized the cemetery entrance ahead. But something had changed. Temporary metal fencing covered part of the gate, and an orange sign had been fastened to it. Annie leaned forward. Is that Pine Hill? Yes. Richard slowed. The sign read, a CCS restricted authorized personnel only. 2 white trucks were parked beyond the gate. Both carried the same dark blue logo on their doors. Caldwell Development Group. Richard brought the SUV to a stop. Annie looked from the locked entrance to him. What does that mean? Richard turned on his phone. The screen filled with missed calls from Linda and Nathan Caldwell. It means, he said, reaching for the door handle. We're about to find out why they wanted me at that meeting so badly. Richard stepped out of the SUV and walked toward the gate. Annie followed, carrying the daisies and her mother's Bible. A man in a gray security uniform left the nearest truck and approached them with a clipboard under one arm. Morning, Richard said. We're here to visit 2 graves in Block B. The cemetery is closed to visitors today. Annie looked past him at the rows of headstones. I only need a few minutes. It's the anniversary of my mother's death. The guard turned toward her. Do you have proof she's buried here? I have the location. That's not what I asked. Annie reached for the folded paper in her pocket, but Richard spoke before she could open it. Why would she carry proof of burial to visit her own mother? The guard looked at Richard more closely, then at the SUV. Recognition changed his manner. Mr. Whitmore? Yes. I didn't realize it was you. Richard glanced at Annie. You didn't need to know who I was to answer her with respect. The guard lowered the clipboard. I'm following instructions. We have survey crews working, and management doesn't want visitors crossing the marked sections. What survey? I don't have those details. You're standing beside 2 Caldwell trucks. The man shifted his weight. You'll need to speak with the site supervisor. Call him. He's busy. Then tell him Richard Whitmore is at the gate. The guard reached for his radio. Annie stepped closer to Richard and spoke quietly. I don't want anyone losing a job because I asked to visit my mother. No one is losing a job. He was doing what somebody told him. So was everyone who signed off on putting a locked gate between families in these graves. Annie glanced toward the orange sign. Maybe we should come back another day. You said today matters. It does. Then we're not leaving. Richard's phone rang. Linda's name appeared again. This time he answered. Finally, she said. Nathan has moved the meeting to the conference room upstairs. He wants to begin in 10 minutes. I'm at Pine Hill. There was a pause. The cemetery? Yes. Why are Caldwell survey crews here? I don't know. You reviewed the project files. I reviewed the acquisition agreement and the financing schedule. The road plan was Caldwell's responsibility. Find it. Richard, the board members are already asking why you're not here. Tell them I'm reviewing a site issue. What kind of issue? A locked cemetery and a road plan no one thought I needed to see. Linda's voice became more cautious. Don't make any decisions until I pull the documents. I'm not making one. I'm asking why a young woman needs permission from a development company to put flowers on her mother's grave. Annie lowered her eyes, uneasy at hearing herself become part of a business call. Linda said, Give me 20 minutes. You have 10. Richard ended the call as another man came through the gate. He wore khaki pants, a Caldwell polo shirt, and sunglasses clipped to his collar. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm Paul Mercer, the field supervisor. I'm sorry about the confusion. Why is the cemetery closed? We're completing a preliminary land survey. There's no construction today." "That wasn't my question." Mercer gave the guard a quick look. "The temporary closure is for safety and efficiency. We have equipment moving through the eastern section. We need Block B. That area isn't part of today's active work." "Then open the gate." Mercer hesitated. "I'm not authorized to allow visitors while the closure notice is posted." Richard held out his hand. "Give me the number of the person who is. I'd have to call our regional office." "Call Nathan Caldwell." Mercer's expression tightened. "Mr. Caldwell doesn't usually handle field access. He'll handle it today." Annie touched Richard's sleeve. "Mr. Whitmore, I can wait outside while you sort this out." Richard looked toward the bouquet. A few petals pressed against the plastic, and one stem had bent near the bottom. "You have already waited long enough." Mercer stepped away to make the call. The guard remained near the gate, no longer questioning Annie but avoiding her eyes. She adjusted the strap of her bag. "You didn't have to tell your assistant about me." She asked what the issue was. "I'm not an issue." Richard turned toward her. "You're right. The gate is." Annie studied him for a moment. "My mother would have liked that answer." Richard wondered what Grace would have thought of him. He doubted one decent sentence would have impressed a woman who had spent months caring for Emily while he found reasons to stay away. Mercer returned. "I spoke to the regional director. You may enter. But I need you to stay on the main path and avoid all marked areas." "And Miss Carter?" Mercer glanced at Annie. "She can enter with you." Annie's mouth tightened. "I could have told you my mother's name 10 minutes ago." Mercer removed a key from his belt. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Would you have opened it if he wasn't here?" The man did not answer. Annie nodded as though that response confirmed what she already knew. The chain dropped from the gate. Richard held it open while she passed. The gesture felt inadequate, yet he could not repair the insult for her by pretending it had not happened. Inside, the cemetery looked smaller than he remembered. Pine needles covered the edges of the road. Several older markers leaned slightly from years of shifting soil. Small flags stood beside the graves of veterans, and artificial flowers had faded under months of sunlight. Annie stopped near a directory mounted beside the chapel. "Block B should be past that stone bench," she said. Richard already knew. They followed the path between the rows. Annie moved carefully, reading names as she passed. She paused once to straighten a small arrangement that had tipped over beside a marker. "You don't know that person," Richard said. "No." "Then why fix it? Someone left it there for a reason." She continued before he could reply. His phone vibrated with a message from Linda. "I found the road proposal. Block B is inside the preliminary access corridor. Do not sign anything. I'm calling legal." Richard read it twice. Ahead, an orange wooden stake rose from the grass near the first row of graves. Another stood 20 feet beyond it. A thin painted line crossed the path and continued between the headstones. Annie saw the markings. "What are those for?" Richard put the phone away. "I don't know yet." They passed the stone bench. The 7th row came into view beyond a cluster of pine trees. Annie's pace quickened. Then she stopped. 2 headstones stood side by side. Grace Carter's marker was newer, the lettering still sharp. Emily Whitmore's was pale with age, and weeds had grown around its base. Annie went first to Grace. She knelt, removed the plastic from the daisies, and placed most of them against the stone. Then she selected one flower and carried it to Emily. Richard watched her set it down. "My mother always brought one for her," Annie said. Richard looked at Emily's name, then at the single white daisy resting beneath it. He had come to Pine Hill because Annie needed a ride. Standing between the 2 graves, he understood that the ride had only brought him to the beginning of what he owed. Annie opened her mother's Bible and placed it on the grass beside Grace's marker. She removed a handkerchief from her bag, poured a little water from a bottle onto one corner, and began cleaning dust from the engraved letters. Richard remained beside Emily's grave, his hands at his sides. Annie glanced up. "You can sit on the bench if you need to." "I'm fine." "You don't look fine." Richard looked at the single daisy beneath Emily's name. "How often did your mother visit her?" "Every few months. More when she was feeling well." "Even after Emily died?" "Yes." "Why?" Annie folded the handkerchief and rubbed dirt from the lower edge of Grace's marker. She said caring about someone shouldn't end just because they can't thank you anymore. Richard lowered his eyes. Your mother did more for Emily than I knew. You keep saying her name like you knew her too. He had expected the question, yet he still needed a moment to answer. I did. Annie waited. Richard stepped closer to Emily's marker. The lettering had faded, but her full name remained clear. Emily Rose Whitmore. He ran his fingers across the top edge of the stone, then withdrew his hand. She was my wife. Annie stopped cleaning. For several seconds, she studied his face as if trying to decide whether she had heard correctly. Your wife? My first wife. The water bottle slipped slightly in Annie's hand, but she caught it before it fell. You're Richard Whitmore. Yes. She looked from him to Emily's grave. Understanding reached her piece by piece. His reaction at the station, his knowledge of the road, the calls he had ignored, and the way he had slowed as they approached the 7th row. My mother said Emily's husband left. Richard did not turn away. He did. You left her. Yes. Annie rose, brushing pine needles from her knees. Her mother's Bible remained open on the grass. She was sick. I know. And you still left? Richard's voice dropped. Yes. Annie crossed her arms, careful not to raise her voice in the cemetery. My mother worked all day at the hospital. Then she cleaned offices at night. She came home with swollen feet and hands that burned from bleach. But she still brought Emily food. Richard accepted each sentence without interrupting. My mother didn't have a nice car, Annie continued. Half the time she had to ask Mrs. Bell for a ride. Sometimes she took the bus with grocery bags in both hands. But she got here. She found a way. I know. No, you don't. Annie's eyes filled, though she kept her voice steady. You know what I'm telling you. That's not the same as knowing what it cost her. Richard looked toward Grace's marker. You're right. You had a car. Yes. You had a phone. Yes. You knew where Emily lived. Yes. Then why didn't you come? A vehicle moved along the service road in the distance. Richard waited until the sound faded before answering. Because I was selfish. Annie seemed surprised by the direct admission. I was building my company, he continued. I kept telling myself I needed more time. One more meeting. One more contract. One more person I had to impress. I sent money and convinced myself that was enough. Was it? No. Did Emily tell you she needed you? Yes. And you still stayed away? Richard looked at her. I had choices. I made the wrong ones. Annie turned toward the graves, pressing her lips together. She picked up the water bottle and tightened the cap even though it was already closed. My mother never said his name, she said. Minna? She only called you Emily's husband. I thought maybe she didn't know who you were. She knew. Then why didn't she tell me? Maybe she didn't want you carrying her anger. Annie shook her head. My mother wasn't angry. That makes it worse. She did not disagree. Richard moved nearer to Grace's marker, leaving enough distance between himself and Annie. Was Emily in pain? He asked. Annie looked at him with disbelief. You're asking me? I know I don't have the right. No, you don't. Richard nodded. Annie's expression shifted when she saw that he would not defend himself. My mother didn't tell me everything. She said some details didn't need to become my memories. I know Emily had difficult days. I know she stopped eating much near the end. And I know my mother stayed with her the last night. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Was she alone when she died? No. The answer struck him harder than accusation. Annie continued. My mother was there. Reverend Brooks came later. Grandma stayed with me at home. Richard looked at Grace's name. Your mother gave her something I should have given her. She gave her company. She gave her loyalty. Annie bent to pick up the Bible. A folded envelope slipped from between the pages and landed on the grass. Richard noticed the handwriting on the front. For Annie, when you visit Grace. She picked it up quickly. My grandmother gave me this morning, she said. Do you know what's inside? No. She said to open it here. Annie sat on the grass beside her mother's grave and slid one finger under the sealed edge. Richard turned slightly, giving her privacy, but she stopped before opening it. Why did you come today? She asked. To bring you. That's not what I mean. You could have dropped me at the gate and left. Richard looked at Emily's marker. I've spent more than 10 years finding reasons not to stand here. Today I ran out of them. That doesn't make up for what you did. I know. And bringing me here doesn't make you a good man. I know that too. Annie studied him. Searching for an excuse or demand in his face, she found neither. She opened the envelope. Inside were two smaller envelopes and a single sheet of paper. One envelope carried Annie's name in Grace's handwriting. The other was older, yellowed near the corners. Across the front, written in faded blue ink, were two words: for Richard. Annie raised her eyes. Richard saw Emily's handwriting and felt his knees weaken. "My mother kept this," Annie said. Richard did not reach for it. "Will you read yours first?" he asked. Annie held the old envelope against her mother's Bible. "No," she said. "First, you're going to tell me why Emily had to leave a letter with a stranger instead of giving it to her husband." Richard kept his eyes on Emily's name. "Because I made it difficult for her to reach me." Annie held the older envelope between two fingers. "How?" "I changed offices twice. I moved out of the house we shared. My number changed, and I told my staff not to put personal calls through unless they came from my sister." "Why would you do that?" "At first, I told myself I needed distance so I could work. Later, I knew exactly what I was doing." "You were avoiding her." "Yes." Annie looked at the faded handwriting across the envelope. "Did she come looking for you?" "I don't know." "You never checked?" "No." The answer made Annie's mouth tighten. Richard could have explained that his company had been close to failure, that creditors called every morning, and that investors demanded more than he believed he could give. None of it changed the fact that Emily had asked him to come home and he had chosen not to. "Reverend Brooks called me when she died," he said. "He mentioned your mother's name. He said Grace had been helping her. And you didn't ask to meet her?" "I asked whether the funeral expenses had been paid." Annie's expression hardened. "I sent money," Richard continued. "It was easier than asking what Emily's last weeks had been like. My mother wasn't looking for money. I understand that now." "No, Mr. Whitmore. You understand that after she's gone." Richard accepted the correction. "Yes." Annie turned the envelope over. The seal was still intact. "My mother must have tried to find you." "She may have. She would have tried more than once." Richard glanced toward the path. The field supervisor and the guard remained near the gate, far enough away that their voices could not be heard. "Then she found the walls I built," he said. Annie placed Emily's letter on top of the Bible and opened the envelope bearing her own name. The paper inside had been folded around a small photograph. She examined the picture first. It showed Grace and Emily sitting together on the steps of a modest house. Grace wore hospital scrubs beneath a cardigan. Emily had a yellow scarf around her head and held a coffee mug in both hands. Neither woman faced the camera formally. Grace was laughing, while Emily watched her with a tired smile. Annie touched the edge of the photograph. "I've never seen this." Richard recognized the yellow scarf Annie had mentioned in the car. He remembered buying it at an airport gift shop after missing Emily's birthday dinner. He had mailed it with a card and assumed the gesture had settled the matter. "That was her favorite scarf," he said. "My mother took care of it after Emily passed. Grandma kept a box of things in her closet, but she never let me open it." Annie unfolded Grace's letter and began reading quietly. Richard moved a few steps away, but she stopped him. "You should hear this." He remained where he was. Annie read aloud. "My Annie, if you are reading this, then you kept your promise and came to see me. I knew you would. Your grandmother may have complained about the bus ride, but she always remembered every stop better than I did." Annie smiled despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "She wrote that before she got too weak to hold a pen for long," she said. She continued, "There is another letter in this envelope. Emily wrote it for Richard Whitmore. I tried to send it to him, but every address I found had changed. I called his office more than once. The people who answered said he was unavailable, and after a while they stopped returning my calls." Annie paused and looked at Richard. He lowered his head. "She did try. I believe you." Annie returned to the page. "I kept the letter because Emily trusted me with it. I never opened it. Some words are meant for one person, even when that person has failed to earn them." Richard's eyes moved toward the old envelope. "Emily was kind to me when she had very little strength left. She worried that helping her took me away from you and your grandmother. I told her kindness is not something a family loses when it is shared. It grows even when money does not." Annie's voice became less steady. "When my time comes, I want to rest beside her. She spent too much of her life waiting for someone to return. I do not want her to wait alone after death." Annie stopped reading. She pressed the letter against the open Bible and looked toward the two markers. Grace's grave was close enough to Emily's that the daisies touched both stones when the wind shifted them. Richard spoke quietly. She asked for this place before she died? Yes. Did she ever say why Emily trusted her? My mother didn't talk about it as if she had done something special. She said Emily needed help, so she helped. Richard looked at Grace's photograph again. She gave Emily more than I did. Annie folded her mother's letter along its original lines. She gave her time. That was what Emily wanted from you, wasn't it? Yes. And now you have plenty of time? No. I have control over more of it. That's not the same thing. No, Richard said. It isn't. Annie picked up Emily's envelope. Richard's hand moved slightly, but he stopped himself before reaching for it. Are you going to read it? She asked. I don't know. My mother kept it for years. I know. She wanted you to have it. I know that too. Annie held it out, but Richard did not take it. What are you afraid it says? That she forgave me. Annie's eyebrows drew together. Why would that scare you? Because forgiveness can become another excuse. A man hears that the person he hurt forgave him, and he decides the matter is finished. And if she didn't forgive you? Then I would have something easier to understand. Anger? Yes. Annie lowered the envelope. Maybe the letter isn't supposed to make things easier. Richard looked at Emily's marker. No, he said. I don't think it is. Before Annie could offer the letter again, the sound of tires came from the service road. A white pickup crossed the cemetery grounds and stopped near the 7th row. 2 survey workers stepped out carrying wooden stakes, a measuring device, and cans of orange marking paint. One of them checked a map, then pointed toward the ground between Grace and Emily. Annie rose. What are they doing? The first worker pressed a stake into the soil several feet from Grace's marker. The second shook a paint can. Richard moved between the workers and the graves. Stop. The man holding the paint lowered his arm. Sir, we have authorization to mark the access corridor. This row is occupied. We know. Annie placed Emily's unopened letter inside her mother's Bible and stood beside Richard. The worker glanced at the map again. These plots are included in the relocation review. Annie's face lost what little color it had. Relocation? The man pointed to a line printed across the survey sheet. The proposed road comes through here. Annie looked from the survey map to the 2 graves. You're saying they plan to move my mother? The worker lowered the paint can. Nothing has been approved yet. We're marking the proposed route. You brought stakes and paint to a cemetery before the families agreed? We don't handle family notifications, ma'am. Richard held out his hand. Let me see the map. The worker hesitated. It's company property. So is part of the money paying for this survey. The man recognized Richard then. His posture changed, and he passed over the sheet. A wide blue line entered the cemetery from the east, crossed Block B, and curved toward a section of undeveloped land beyond the trees. Grace and Emily's plot sat near the center of the proposed corridor. Richard examined the project number printed in the lower corner. It matched the development agreement waiting for him downtown. Annie stepped closer. What does it say? The road would pass through this row. Through it? The graves would be moved before construction. Moved where? The worker answered before Richard could. A designated section chosen by cemetery management. Annie faced him. My mother chose this place. I understand. No, you don't. She asked to be beside Emily. You can't put her somewhere else and call it the same. We only follow the approved plan. Richard folded the map once. There is no approved plan. We were told to begin preliminary markings. By whom? Our supervisor. And who gave him the order? The man looked toward the second worker, who had stopped unloading equipment. You'll need to ask Mr. Mercer. I already did. He claimed not to know the details. Richard removed his phone and called Linda. She answered immediately. I have legal reviewing the corridor now. Did Whitmore Holdings approve a route through Block B? Not directly. Caldwell submitted a preliminary map as part of the development package. Your office received it 6 weeks ago. Who reviewed it? Planning summarized the impact as limited relocation within a private cemetery. Richard looked at Annie. How many graves? I don't have the final number. The initial estimate says 32 to 40. Were the families contacted? The Caldwell report says notices were issued. Annie heard him. We never received anything. Richard turned slightly away from the workers. Grace Carter's family received no notice. Linda typed at the other end of the line. Give me the plot. Block B, row 7. Grace Carter is beside Emily Whitmore. Linda stopped typing. Emily? Yes. She did not ask further questions. I'll check both records. Find out who selected this route and what other options were considered. Richard, Nathan has called the board. He says you're delaying the entire agreement over field access. I'm delaying it because his employees are marking graves before the people affected know what is happening. The meeting can't stay open all day. Then close it. Do you want me to formally suspend the signing? Richard looked at the orange stake beside Grace's grave. Yes. Linda paused. That will trigger a review from the board. Start the review. He ended the call. The first survey worker pointed toward the map still in Richard's hand. Sir, we've been scheduled to finish this section by noon. You're finished now. I can't stop the assignment without authorization. Richard took out his phone again and called Nathan Caldwell. Nathan answered on the second ring. I assume you finally decided to join us. I'm at Pine Hill. I heard. You knew the access road crossed occupied plots. It crosses a portion of an old private cemetery. The remains will be transferred professionally. Did the families agree? The cemetery has authority under the purchase terms. That wasn't my question. Nathan sighed. Not every family answers certified mail. The law provides a process when relatives can't be reached. The Carter family was never contacted. Then someone entered an outdated address. That's an administrative issue, not a reason to threaten a $400 million project. Annie stood near Grace's marker, listening. Richard said, How many families are affected? I don't carry burial records in my pocket. You expect me to sign the agreement while your crew is placing marks between headstones. I expect you to act like the man who built Whitmore Holdings. Richard lowered his voice. Show me the alternate routes. There are no practical alternatives. Practical or profitable? Nathan did not answer immediately. The western route adds nearly $4 million in grading and drainage, he said. The northern route requires another parcel. This corridor is the only one that keeps the budget where we agreed. So the graves are the cheapest option. The graves can be moved. The land cannot. Annie's face tightened. Richard looked at the white daisy beneath Emily's name. Stop the survey until the families are properly notified. No. Then Whitmore Holdings suspends its participation. Nathan gave a brief laugh. You don't suspend a project like this from a cemetery path. You have lenders, board members, and hundreds of jobs tied to that agreement. I know what is tied to it. Do you? Because you sound emotional, Richard. I'm asking for lawful notice and a route review. You're asking everyone to lose money because one young woman showed up with flowers. Annie turned away, but Richard saw that she had heard. This is not about one woman. It always starts that way. One person objects. A local reporter arrives. Then every distant relative decides a neglected grave is priceless. Richard's voice hardened. Tell your crew to leave Block B. Nathan replied. Come to the meeting. We'll keep Emily's plot where it is. I can have the engineers adjust the line by a few feet. Richard looked at Grace's marker beside it. And Grace Carter? A pause followed. We can offer the family a relocation payment. Richard ended the call. The survey workers waited for instructions. Pack your equipment, he told them. No one marks another plot until legal review is complete. The first worker called his supervisor while the other returned the stakes to the truck. Annie picked up Emily's letter and placed it inside the Bible. Her movements were controlled, but her eyes had changed. You're part of this project, she said. Richard did not avoid the question. My company is financing part of it. You knew they were building here? I knew the project was near Pine Hill. I did not know the road crossed the graves. You signed papers without knowing? I relied on summaries. Annie gave a short, bitter laugh. People like you always have a softer word for not paying attention. Richard returned the map to the worker. You're right. That doesn't help my mother. No. And stopping two men for one morning doesn't protect her. No. Annie lifted the bouquet from Grace's grave so she could remove the plastic caught beneath it. Richard said, I suspended the signing. For how long? Until I know what happened. And after you know? He had no answer that would earn her trust. Annie placed the flowers back against the stone. You didn't know because people like my mother never matter until we stand in the way of something expensive. Richard looked at the orange line cutting across the grass. Annie closed the Bible and held it against her chest. Thank you for the ride, Mr. Whitmore. I'll find the bus home. She walked toward the main path before he could respond. Richard remained between the two graves as the survey truck pulled away. His meeting had been suspended, his partner was angry, and the board would soon demand an explanation. For the first time that morning, those were not the problems he feared most. Richard waited until Annie reached the bend near the chapel before he followed. He did not call after her. She had every reason to walk away, and another apology offered too quickly would only ask her to make him feel better. A man stepped from the side entrance of New Hope Baptist Church before Richard reached the path. He wore a dark cardigan over a white shirt and carried a ring of keys in one hand. His hair had turned silver, but Richard recognized the measured walk. "Mr. Whitmore." Richard stopped. "Reverend Brooks." Samuel Brooks glanced toward the departing survey truck, then toward the orange marks near the graves. "I heard Caldwell had people out here. I did not expect to find you with them." "I didn't come with them. No. You came in the car that helps pay for them." Richard accepted the distinction. "My company's involved." Samuel studied him for a moment. "And Annie?" "She found out. That explains why she is walking away from you." Richard looked toward the chapel. Annie had stopped beside a stone wall, her mother's Bible held against her chest. "I suspended the signing." "For the day?" "Until the route is reviewed." Samuel's expression did not change. Men with money often call a delay an act of conscience. "I know a delay isn't enough. That is not the same as knowing what comes next." Richard glanced at the pastor's keys. "Were you the one who helped Grace arrange the burial?" "I helped with the paperwork. Ruth handled most of it. Grace had already chosen the plot. Beside Emily." "Yes. Did you know she kept a letter for me?" Samuel looked toward Annie. "Grace told me she had something Emily wanted delivered. She tried your office several times. I heard. She never asked me to chase you through corporate receptions or newspaper photographs. She said a man who wanted to be found would leave a door open." Richard lowered his eyes. "I closed every one." "You did." Samuel's tone carried no satisfaction. He walked toward the chapel, and Richard fell into step beside him. "Grace did not need your money," Samuel said. "She needed you to admit that what she did mattered." "It mattered. You are saying that now because you have seen the grave. I should have said it while she was alive." "Yes." They reached Annie. She had opened the Bible again, but Emily's envelope remained tucked between the pages. Samuel greeted her gently. "Your grandmother called the church." Annie looked up. "Is she all right?" "She is worried, which is normal for Ruth. Mrs. Bell is with her. She asked me to make sure you reached the cemetery." "I did. I can see that." Annie glanced at Richard. "I'm leaving." Samuel looked toward the road. "The nearest stop is a long walk. I'll manage." "I know you can. That does not mean you should have to." Richard spoke carefully. "I can take you home." "No. Then Reverend Brooks can drive you." Samuel shook his head. "My car is at the mechanic. I walked over from the church office." Annie looked at him. "You could have mentioned that before making it sound like you had a solution." "I was working toward one." A small smile touched Annie's mouth, then disappeared. Samuel nodded toward the Bible. "Did you open Grace's letter?" "Yes." "And Emily's?" "No," Richard said. "She doesn't owe me that." Annie turned to him. "My mother kept it for years. She wanted it delivered. That was before you knew who I was. She knew who you were. I meant before you knew." Samuel rested one hand on the stone wall. "Annie, giving him the letter does not excuse him. Keeping it does not punish Emily's memory. The question is what your mother asked you to do." Annie looked down at the worn envelope. "She asked me to make sure he received it." Richard remained where he was. After a moment, Annie held it out. "Take it." He did not move. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm not offering forgiveness. I'm delivering a letter." Richard accepted the envelope with both hands. The paper felt fragile. Emily's handwriting crossed the front in faded ink, the same slant he had once seen on grocery lists, birthday cards, and notes left beside the coffee maker. "Read it here," Annie said. Richard looked at her. "Are you sure? My mother waited years for you to hear it. I'm not walking away before I know you did." Richard opened the seal carefully. Inside was one sheet folded twice. He began in silence, but Annie spoke. Out loud, Richard unfolded the paper. "Richard," he read, "if this reaches you, then Grace found a way that I could not." His voice tightened, but he continued. "I spent many months wondering what I did wrong. Then I understood that your leaving was not proof that I lacked value. It was proof that you had begun measuring value by the wrong things." Richard paused. Annie stood without looking away. He read on. "I do not blame you for wanting more than we had. I wanted more, too. I wanted a safe home, steady work, and mornings when we did not count every dollar before buying groceries. But I never wanted more at the cost of becoming strangers. The paper trembled slightly in his hand. Grace comes after long shifts and brings food she cannot easily spare. She sits with me when I am tired and talks about ordinary things. Her mother's cornbread, Annie's schoolwork, the neighbor who plays gospel too loudly on Sunday mornings. She does not treat me like a burden. She reminds me that care is not a debt. Richard stopped again. Samuel looked toward the graves. Annie said, "Keep going." Richard drew a breath. "You once told me poverty was having no choices. I believed you. Now I think poverty can also be having choices and using them only for yourself." He closed his eyes briefly before reading the final lines. "You were not poor because we had no money. You became poor when you stopped knowing how to love. I hope one day you become rich again, in the only way that matters." The letter ended with Emily's name. Richard lowered the page. Annie waited, but he had no words that would improve what Emily had written. Samuel broke the quiet. "She did not ask you for a monument." "No, she did not ask you to defend your past." "No. What did she ask?" Richard looked toward Emily's grave, then Grace's. "To become someone who would stay." Annie folded her arms. "Are you going to?" Richard took out his phone and called Linda. She answered at once. "I found the route file. Send every document to outside counsel. I want the notices, delivery records, alternate routes, cemetery agreements, and every signature connected to Block B. That could expose our part in the financing." "I know. The board will fight you." "I know that too." Linda paused. "What should I tell Caldwell?" Richard looked at the orange paint cutting through the grass. "Tell him the signing is suspended until every family has been contacted and every signature has been verified. And if he refuses, then there is no deal." Richard ended the call. Annie did not look impressed. "That protects the graves today." "Yes. What about tomorrow?" Richard folded Emily's letter along its original creases. "Tomorrow I start finding out how many people were ignored." Samuel nodded once. "That is closer to an answer." Annie picked up the daisies she had set beside the wall. "I still don't trust you." "You shouldn't yet." She looked toward the cemetery gate. "But I need a ride home." Richard put Emily's letter inside his coat pocket, close enough that he could feel its edge against his chest. "The car is this way," he said. They began walking together, but before they reached the path, Linda called again. Her first sentence stopped Richard. "Ruth Carter's name is on a relocation consent form." Annie turned. Richard put the call on speaker. Linda continued. "The document says she signed it 6 weeks ago." Annie's face hardened. "My grandmother never signed anything." Richard looked back toward the orange marks near the 2 graves. "Then someone signed for her." Annie took the phone from Richard before Linda could continue. "Can you send me the document?" "I can send a copy, but I need an email address." Annie gave it to her, then opened the message as soon as it arrived. The form carried the Pine Hill logo at the top, followed by several paragraphs authorizing the cemetery to relocate Grace Carter's remains. Near the bottom was Ruth Carter's name and a signature written in a smooth, looping hand. Annie enlarged the image. "That isn't hers." "Are you certain?" Linda asked. "My grandmother signs everything the same way. Her handwriting shakes because of her arthritis. This looks like someone practiced it." Richard stepped closer but did not take the phone. "What address is listed?" Annie read it aloud. "That's our old apartment. We moved almost 3 years ago." Linda said. "The certified notice was sent there and marked undeliverable." 2 weeks later, the file shows a consent form received by hand. "Received from whom?" Richard asked. "There's no name, only the initials DM. Find out who those initials identify." "I'm already checking." Richard looked toward the cemetery gate. "Send the form to outside counsel and tell them to preserve the original. No one at Caldwell or Pine Hill touches it." Linda hesitated. "Richard, if this signature is false, we may be dealing with more than a bad notification process." "I understand." Annie handed the phone back. "I need to show this to my grandmother." Richard nodded. "We'll go now." Samuel lifted his keys. "I'll ask the church secretary to start calling the other families. If Ruth's name was used, hers may not be the only one." Richard looked at him. "Tell them not to sign anything and not to speak with Caldwell without a lawyer. Most of them don't have lawyers." "They will." Annie's expression tightened. Paid for by you? Paid for by my company. That company helped fund the project. Yes. So now it pays to investigate itself? Richard met her eyes. That is one reason the attorneys will report to the families, not to me. Samuel gave a small nod. Better. They returned to the SUV. Annie kept her mother's Bible on her lap, with Emily's letter safely inside. Richard started the engine, but before pulling away, he called Linda once more. Get me the complete list of affected plots. I have 28 confirmed in the first corridor map. There may be more in the revised version. How many consent forms? 17. And how many were signed? According to the file, 14. Verify everyone. That could take days. Start with the signatures received by hand. Linda lowered her voice. Nathan is asking who authorized outside counsel. I did. He says Caldwell owns the relocation records. Then he can explain that position in writing. Richard ended the call and drove through the open gate. Annie remained quiet until the cemetery disappeared behind the trees. My grandmother is going to blame herself. For what? For not knowing. She was never informed. That won't matter to her. She thinks she's supposed to keep track of everything. She shouldn't have to defend a grave from paperwork she never received. Annie looked through the side window. People say that a lot. That someone shouldn't have to fight. But the people saying it usually aren't the ones doing the fighting. Richard accepted the rebuke. Then tell me what would help. Don't make promises before you know you can keep them. That's fair. And don't speak for my grandmother when we get there. I won't. They drove back toward Birmingham. The morning traffic had thinned, though a line had formed near a roadwork crew. Richard's phone displayed several calls from Nathan and 2 board members. He ignored them. Annie noticed. You can answer. Not while I'm driving. You answered your assistant earlier. She usually has useful information. And the others don't? Not yet. Annie almost smiled, but concern returned when she checked the forged form again. My grandmother keeps every paper, she said. Utility bills, church programs, grocery receipts. She has birthday cards from people who died before I was born. Then she may still have the notices from Pine Hill, if they sent any to the correct address. Richard turned onto a residential street lined with modest apartment buildings. Annie directed him toward a 2-story brick complex, with flower pots arranged along the front walkway. Mrs. Bell opened the door before they reached it. She was a broad-shouldered woman in a house dress and cardigan, holding a wooden spoon. Annie Carter, you said you found a ride. You did not say you were coming home in a car that costs more than this building. I didn't ask what it cost. Mrs. Bell looked at Richard. Who are you? Richard Whitmore. That name is supposed to mean something to me? Not necessarily. Good answer. Come inside. Ruth has been asking the same question every 6 minutes. The apartment smelled of cinnamon, oatmeal, and furniture polish. Ruth sat in a recliner near the window, a blanket across her knees. Her gray hair had been combed neatly, and she still wore the navy church dress she had chosen for the cemetery. Annie. She held out one hand. Did you get there? Annie knelt beside her. Yes, ma'am. I took the flowers. And you read the letter? I did. Ruth's eyes moved to Richard. Recognition did not come immediately, but when Annie introduced him, her hand closed around the arm of the chair. Emily's Richard? He did not correct the judgment in her voice. Yes, ma'am. Ruth looked at him for several seconds. You took your time. I did. Mrs. Bell stopped stirring the oatmeal. Annie sat beside Ruth and opened the form on her phone. Grandma, I need you to look at something. Ruth put on the reading glasses hanging from a cord around her neck. Annie enlarged the signature and held the screen steady. Is that yours? Ruth examined it, then shook her head. No. Did anyone from Pine Hill or Caldwell bring you papers 6 weeks ago? No one came here. Did you give anyone permission to move Mom? Ruth's face changed. Move Grace where? Annie placed a hand over hers. They marked part of the cemetery for a road. They cannot move her. She chose that place. Richard spoke carefully. We have suspended the project while the documents are reviewed. Ruth turned to him. Suspended means it can start again. Yes. Then don't use that word like it should comfort me. Richard nodded. You're right. Ruth pointed toward a small writing desk. Annie, bring me the green box. Inside were bank statements, medical bills, church receipts, and several handwritten notes. Ruth removed a Christmas card and placed it beside the signature on Annie's phone. The difference was obvious. Ruth's real signature was uneven, with a shortened final stroke. The consent form used rounded letters and a full middle initial Ruth, never included. Mrs. Bell looked over Annie's shoulder. Whoever wrote that never met Ruth. She complains about her middle name every time a form asks for it. Ruth reached deeper into the box and removed an unopened envelope stamped "Return to Sender." It had been forwarded from their old address months earlier. The sender was Pine Hill Memorial Cemetery. Richard read the date. It matched the week before the consent form appeared. They knew the notice had failed, he said. Ruth looked at him. And someone decided my answer anyway. Richard's phone rang. Nathan Caldwell's name appeared on the screen. This time, Richard answered. Nathan spoke before Richard could greet him. You have no authority to seize our records or contact families connected to the site. Richard looked at Ruth, Annie, and the false signature displayed between them. I'm not seizing anything, he said. I'm verifying what your company claims they agreed to. You're creating panic. No, Nathan. Someone created consent. Nathan's voice became harder. Come to the office, and we'll settle this privately. Richard looked at Ruth's real signature beside the forged one. That option ended before I arrived. Nathan did not answer for several seconds. When he spoke again, the polished tone he used in meetings was gone. You're making a serious mistake. Richard remained beside Ruth's chair. Someone used her name to authorize the removal of her daughter's grave. You have one questionable signature. That does not prove Caldwell had anything to do with it. It proves the process cannot continue. The process has already continued. Contractors are scheduled, lenders have released funds, and the city expects the access work to begin this week. Then everyone involved will have to adjust. Nathan gave a dry laugh. You think you can freeze a $400 million project from an apartment living room? Richard looked at Ruth's green box, the return notice, and the false consent form on Annie's phone. I think I can refuse to finance it. You cannot withdraw without penalties. I know the agreement. Then you know what it will cost. Yes. Nathan lowered his voice. The board will remove you before they let you destroy this deal. That is their decision. And what about the employees tied to the project? The contractors? The people expecting work? Richard had anticipated the argument. It was the kind men like Nathan used whenever profit needed a more respectable face. Do not place your decisions on the shoulders of workers you never consulted. I am talking about consequences. So when ye, Nathan paused, come downtown, we can correct the Carter paperwork, preserve Emily's grave, and review the rest later. Ruth's eyes narrowed when she heard Emily's name. Richard asked, what happens to Grace Carter's grave? We offer relocation costs and an additional payment to the family. You mean you pay them to accept a decision you already made? I mean we solve the problem. Annie rose from the arm of the sofa. My mother is not a problem. Nathan heard her through the phone. Who is that? Annie Carter. This is a business discussion, Richard. She is one of the people your business affects. She is too young to understand the scale of this project. Annie stepped closer to the phone. I understand that you sent a letter to an address where we haven't lived in years. I understand someone signed my grandmother's name after the letter came back. I understand your road goes across my mother's grave because another route costs more. Nathan did not respond to her directly. Richard, take me off speaker. No. This conversation is privileged. No, it isn't. Nathan's voice sharpened. Get to the office within the hour, or I will inform the board that you are refusing to perform your duties. Inform them. Richard ended the call. Mrs. Bell returned to the kitchen and switched off the stove before the oatmeal burned. That man talks like a person who has never been told no. He's been told no, Richard said. He just charges people for doing it. Ruth removed her glasses and folded them on her lap. You said your company helped pay for the road. Yes, ma'am. Did you read the papers? Not closely enough. Then you signed because someone told you it was safe. I had not signed the final agreement, but you gave them money. Richard did not soften the truth. Yes. Ruth nodded as though confirming something for herself. People with money hire others to carry the guilt in smaller boxes. One person writes the report, another signs the permit, another paints the ground. By the time the damage is done, everyone says they only handled one piece. Richard looked at the returned envelope. That is what happened here. No, Ruth said. That is what is still happening. Annie sat beside her and took her hand. Richard's phone rang again. Linda's name appeared. I need to answer this. Ruth gestured toward the phone. Then answer it. He stepped toward the window but stayed close enough that Annie and Ruth could hear. Linda spoke quickly. I found DM. His name is Douglas Mercer. He is listed as a compliance coordinator for a subcontractor Caldwell hired to manage cemetery notices. Related to Paul Mercer at the site? I'm checking. There's more. 5 of the consent forms received by hand use the same witness signature. 3 families supposedly signed on the same afternoon, but the addresses are more than 40 miles apart. Any return notices? At least 9. And Caldwell proceeded anyway. The file labels them resolved. Richard looked toward Annie's phone. How? That part is missing. Missing or removed? I can't tell yet. Linda continued. Nathan called 2 board members. They want an emergency meeting at noon. He is arguing that you have a personal conflict because Emily is buried in the project area. He offered to save Emily's grave and move Grace. I assumed he would. Why? Because he thinks your guilt is negotiable. Richard absorbed the accuracy of that statement. Linda said, the board may order you to step away from the review. Then outside counsel continues without me. They will need authority. Give the affected families control of the legal fund. That is not a standard arrangement. Neither is financing the removal of graves with forged consent. Linda was quiet for a moment. I'll prepare it. Send copies of the suspicious forms to Reverend Brooks. He is contacting the families. I need written permission before sharing personal records. Redact private financial information and send each family only the form connected to their plot. I can do that. And Linda? Yes? Do not let anyone from Caldwell access the original files. I've already restricted the folder. When the call ended, Annie asked, how many signatures might be false? We do not know yet. That means more families could lose someone's grave without knowing. Yes. She picked up her mother's Bible. Then we should tell them. Ruth nodded. New Hope has a phone list. Richard said, Reverend Brooks is already making calls. That's not enough, Annie replied. People ignore unfamiliar numbers. Some of the older members won't understand a legal email. We need to show them the papers. We can arrange a meeting. At the church, Ruth said. People know the church. Richard checked the time. The emergency board meeting would begin in less than an hour. I have to go downtown first. Annie's disappointment appeared before she concealed it. Of course you do. I'm not going to save the deal. You said not to trust promises. You shouldn't. Then what should I trust? Richard looked at Emily's letter inside his coat, then at the false signature on Annie's screen. What I do next? Ruth picked up her glasses again. A man can say he has changed before lunch and return to his old habits by supper. Richard met her gaze. Then judge me at supper. Mrs. Bell placed a covered bowl of oatmeal on the table. You'd better eat before you start challenging billionaires, Ruth. I just challenged one. And he's still standing. Sit down. Annie helped Ruth adjust the blanket across her knees. Richard moved toward the door, but Annie followed him into the hallway. What happens if the board removes you? My company continues without me. And the cemetery? The legal review continues. What if Caldwell sends the machines back? Richard paused at the door. Then we make sure they find more than locked gates and unsigned forms waiting for them. Annie searched his face. What does that mean? It means the families need to know before Caldwell decides silence is permission. He handed her Linda's business card. Call Reverend Brooks. Ask him to open the church tonight. Linda will send the records we can legally share. And you? I'm going to tell a board of wealthy people why the cheapest road has become the most expensive decision they have ever made. Richard reached Whitmore Holdings 12 minutes before the emergency board meeting. Linda was waiting outside the conference room with a tablet, a folder of copied records, and the expression she wore when a problem had already spread beyond one department. Nathan brought his attorneys, she said. He also invited 2 lenders without telling us. He wants the money in the room to speak before the facts do. The board may suspend your authority over the project. Have the legal fund documents been prepared? They're being reviewed. The affected families will select independent counsel, and Whitmore Holdings will cover the fees without controlling the case. Richard took the folder. Good. Linda studied him. You know this may not end with Pine Hill. If the board believes your personal history affected your judgment, they may question every decision you've made on the project. They should. That isn't what I expected you to say. It isn't what I would have said yesterday. They entered together. Nathan Caldwell sat near the far end of the table with two attorneys beside him. The board members had copies of the development agreement, projected returns, and a statement Caldwell's public relations team had prepared before the meeting began. Nathan spoke first. Richard has allowed a personal matter to interfere with a project that supports hundreds of jobs and significant tax revenue. Richard placed the copied consent form in front of the board chair. This is Ruth Carter's authorization to move her daughter's grave. The chair adjusted his glasses. What are we looking at? A signature she did not write, attached to a notice sent to an address where she hasn't lived in 3 years. Nathan folded his hands. One disputed document does not invalidate the entire process. Linda opened her tablet. We have identified 5 forms received by hand with the same witness signature. 3 were supposedly collected on the same afternoon at addresses more than 40 miles apart. One lender looked toward Nathan. Is that accurate? We're reviewing the subcontractor's work. You told me this morning the families had been notified, Richard said. They were notified according to the records provided to us. Records your company paid to create. Nathan's attorney intervened. No one here should make accusations before a formal review. Richard nodded. Then we agree the project cannot proceed until that review is complete. A board member named Harris turned to him. Suspending the project could cost this company millions before we know whether the signatures are false. And continuing could result in graves being moved under false consent. We can preserve the affected plots temporarily. That is what Nathan offered me. Save one grave, pay another family, and keep the road where it is. Nathan's chair shifted against the floor. I offered a practical compromise. You offered to protect Emily because she was my wife. Grace Carter was treated as an expense that could be settled. The board chair looked up. Your wife is buried in this cemetery? My first wife. Nathan pushed a prepared statement across the table. This is why Richard must remove himself. His judgment is compromised. Richard did not touch the statement. My judgment was compromised when I approved financing based on summaries instead of examining who would pay the human cost. I won't repeat that mistake. Because it is more profitable. Harris frowned. You are placing the company in a difficult position. The company entered that position when it funded a plan built on failed notices and questionable signatures. Nathan's voice hardened. You are willing to damage your own employees to impress a family you met this morning. No, I am willing to stop pretending that payroll and fraud belong in the same argument. The board chair raised a hand before Nathan could answer. We will suspend the signing for 48 hours. Richard will step away from direct control of the internal review. Outside counsel will report to the audit committee. Richard said, the families must also receive independent representation. That can be considered. It must be approved today. Harris objected. We cannot give strangers unlimited access to company funds. Richard opened the second folder. The fund is capped, independently administered, and limited to the cemetery matter. Linda has the terms. Linda distributed the documents. Nathan read the first page and looked across the table. You prepared this before the board authorized it. I prepared for people who were never given the opportunity to protect themselves. The board approved the fund after 20 minutes of revisions. Richard was removed from direct oversight of the investigation, but the project remained suspended. Nathan left without shaking his hand. As Richard gathered his papers, Linda received a message and showed him the screen. Caldwell had issued a statement claiming that a small number of record discrepancies were being used to obstruct a major economic development. He's trying to define the story before the families speak, Linda said. Then make sure the families receive their records before the evening news. By 6 o'clock, the fellowship hall at New Hope Baptist Church was full. Folding chairs had been arranged in rows beneath old photographs of church picnics, veteran ceremonies, and community dinners. Ruth sat near the front with Mrs. Bell. Annie stood beside a table where Linda had organized envelopes by family name. People arrived carrying burial receipts, deeds, old photographs, and letters from Pine Hill. Several had received notices at former addresses. Others had received nothing. Reverend Brooks opened the meeting without a long prayer. We are here because decisions were made using names that were not invited into the discussion, he said. Tonight, those names will speak for themselves. Annie handed an envelope to an older man named Mr. Lewis. He opened it, read the consent form, and shook his head. My wife never signed this. She passed 2 years before the date printed here. Linda recorded the information. A woman across the aisle raised her hand. They sent my notice to my mother's house. That house was sold in 2018. Another family found a signature with the wrong middle initial. By the end of the first hour, 6 forms had been challenged. Richard remained near the back. He answered questions when asked but did not lead the meeting. Ruth noticed. "You're quieter here than you were on the telephone," she said when he brought her a cup of coffee. "This isn't my meeting." "No, it isn't." She accepted the cup. "That may be the first useful thing you've understood today." Annie approached with Emily's letter inside her mother's Bible. "The legal fund was approved," Richard told her. "I heard. The families choose the lawyers. That was the right decision. It was not forgiveness, but it was the first time she had acknowledged one of his actions without suspicion." Reverend Brooks joined them. "Justice does not become fair simply because a wealthy man finally notices the harm." Richard nodded. "I know." Samuel looked toward the families comparing signatures. "But sometimes his responsibility is to open the door, step aside, and make sure it cannot be closed again." Linda crossed the hall toward them, holding her phone. "We have a problem," she said. "Caldwell moved the survey schedule forward. Equipment is being delivered to Pine Hill before sunrise." Annie tightened her hold on the Bible. "The project is suspended. The signing is suspended," Linda replied. "Nathan claims the existing survey permit remains valid." Richard looked at Reverend Brooks. Samuel turned toward the gathered families. "They expected paperwork to keep you home," he said. "It appears they were wrong." Reverend Brooks stepped to the center of the fellowship hall and raised one hand. Conversations slowed as families turned toward him. "Caldwell is sending equipment to Pine Hill before sunrise," he said. "Their attorneys claim the survey permit remains active, even while the development agreement is under review." Mr. Lewis stood from the second row. "Can they move the graves?" "Not tonight," Linda replied. "The permit allows marking and soil testing. It does not authorize relocation. But once equipment enters Block B, Caldwell may argue that the work has already begun." A woman near the aisle lifted her consent form. "Then we need a judge. Outside counsel is preparing an emergency request," Linda said. "The courthouse is closed, so they're contacting the judge assigned to after-hours civil matters. There is no guarantee we'll have an order before morning." Ruth adjusted the blanket over her knees. "The machines arrive before the law does, and everyone acts surprised when ordinary people stop trusting the law." Richard stood near the back wall. "Then Caldwell cannot be allowed to work without witnesses." Annie turned toward him. "What are you suggesting?" "That the families meet at Pine Hill before the equipment arrives. Attorneys can document every action. Reporters should be notified. No one touches a machine or threatens a worker. You remain on the public side of the marked area and record what happens." Mr. Lewis shook his head. "You expect elderly people to stand outside a cemetery before dawn?" "No," Richard said. "I expect Caldwell to hope they won't." That answer moved through the hall without applause. People began checking watches and calling relatives. Reverend Brooks took control of the arrangements. "Those who can drive will offer seats. Bring coats, folding chairs, water, and any burial documents you have. We meet at the church at 4:30 and leave together at 5. Mrs. Bell looked at Ruth. "You're staying home." Ruth turned slowly. "No, I am not. You could barely cross the hallway this morning, and Grace's grave could be marked before breakfast. Your knees don't care about legal strategy. My knees have complained for 20 years. They do not make family decisions." Annie crouched beside her. "Grandma, I can go for both of us." Ruth touched Annie's cheek. "Your mother stood beside people when she was tired. I can stand beside her when I am old." Annie lowered her eyes. Knowing further argument would only waste time, Linda's phone rang. She moved toward the kitchen entrance to answer, then returned with her tablet. "We found Douglas Mercer," she said. "He's Paul Mercer's older brother. Paul supervises the Pine Hill field crew. Douglas works for Southern Land Compliance, the subcontractor that handled family notices." Richard's expression tightened. "So one brother collected the supposed approvals, and the other controls access to the cemetery." "Yes." Douglas submitted 11 forms marked as hand, delivered. 9 involved notices that had already been returned. "Do the signatures match?" "A handwriting specialist can't give a formal opinion tonight, but several appear to have been written by the same person. The pressure, letter spacing, and witness marks are nearly identical." Annie held Ruth's genuine signature beside the disputed form. Who approved them? Linda scrolled through the records. A Caldwell project administrator named David Sloan marked the files resolved. Sloan left the company 2 weeks ago. Where is he now? Richard asked. We haven't reached him. Keep trying. Nathan called again. Richard answered away from the families, though Annie remained near enough to hear his side. You've turned a paperwork review into a public spectacle, Nathan said. You moved the equipment schedule after the signing was suspended. The survey was authorized months ago. Using consent forms your subcontractor may have falsified. You have no proof my company directed that. Then delay the survey voluntarily. No. Why? Because delays create leverage. Once every family believes a faded headstone is worth a fortune, this project will never move forward. Richard looked across the hall at people holding photographs, deeds, and returned envelopes. You still think this is about increasing payments? It usually is. That is why you never expected them to organize. Nathan lowered his voice. You should be careful, Richard. Your own company appears on the financing documents. If this becomes fraud, you will not stand outside it. I'm not trying to. Then protect yourself. I am protecting the record. Nathan ended the call. Annie approached. Did he threaten you? He reminded me that Whitmore Holdings may face consequences. Does that scare you? Yes. She appeared surprised. Richard continued. Fear doesn't excuse what someone does next. Annie nodded toward the families. My mother used to say courage isn't the absence of fear. It's deciding fear doesn't get the final vote. Grace and Emily would have understood each other. They did. By 9 that evening, the meeting ended. Linda distributed copies of the questioned forms and contact information for independent counsel. Reverend Brooks arranged transportation. Mrs. Bell packed coffee, biscuits, and blankets into reusable grocery bags while continuing to tell Ruth she was stubborn. Richard returned to his office but did not go home. He and Linda reviewed maps, permits, and email chains past midnight. One document showed that Caldwell's engineers had considered a western route through vacant land. It had been rejected because drainage work would add nearly $4 million. Richard read the note twice. The cemetery route had not been chosen because it was necessary. It had been chosen because the dead could not object, and their families were expected to lack money. At 2:30, outside counsel reported that the emergency request had been filed. The judge's clerk could not promise a ruling before business hours. At 3:40, Linda received confirmation that 2 excavators and a survey truck had left a Caldwell equipment yard. They're moving earlier than we were told, she said. Richard closed the project file. Call Reverend Brooks. He's already awake. I assumed he would be. Before 4:30, cars filled the New Hope parking lot. Headlights cut across the church lawn as families helped one another load chairs and thermoses. Ruth arrived in Mrs. Bell's sedan, dressed in the same navy church dress she had worn the day before. Annie walked beside her, carrying Grace's Bible and 2 white daisies saved from the bouquet. Richard came alone in the SUV. He wore a plain dark coat instead of a suit. Annie met him near the church steps. Did the judge answer? Not yet, so we may have no order when we arrive. That's possible. What stops the machines? Richard looked toward the line of cars preparing to leave. Witnesses, lawyers, cameras, and people Caldwell believed would stay home. The convoy reached Pine Hill while the eastern sky was beginning to pale. Temporary lights glowed behind the gate. A truck carrying an excavator was already parked along the service road. Annie helped Ruth from the car. Beyond the fence, an engine started. The law had not arrived. The families had. The cemetery gate remained closed as more cars entered the church parking area across the road. Families carried folding chairs, thermoses, framed photographs, and envelopes containing burial records. No one raised a sign or blocked traffic. They gathered in small groups, speaking quietly while Reverend Brooks moved among them, checking on the older members and reminding everyone to remain on the public side of the fence. Ruth stood beside Annie with one hand on her cane. Mrs. Bell had wrapped a wool scarf around Ruth's shoulders and placed a cup of coffee in her free hand. You should sit until we know what they're doing, Annie said. I sat most of yesterday. That doesn't mean you have to make up for it today. Ruth lifted the cup. I'm standing beside Grace. I can drink coffee at the same time. Inside the cemetery, Paul Mercer spoke with two equipment operators near the survey truck. The excavator's engine continued running, but the machine remained on the service road. Orange safety lights turned slowly above the cab. Richard approached the gate with Linda and an attorney from the independent legal team. Paul met them from the other side. "The cemetery is closed," Paul said. "You said that yesterday," Richard replied. "And the restriction is still in place. The development agreement is suspended. The survey permit isn't." Linda held up a copy of the court filing. "An emergency request is pending. Your company has been informed that multiple consent forms are disputed." Paul looked at the attorney. "Are you telling me there's a court order?" "Not yet." "Then the crew has authority to continue." "Authority to perform soil tests," the attorney said. "Not to disturb markers, remove remains, or prevent families from documenting your work." Paul glanced toward the growing crowd. "This is private property," Ruth called from behind Richard. "My daughter is inside that gate. Don't talk to us as if we wandered into your yard." Paul recognized her name from the disputed form. "Mrs. Carter, I'm not authorized to discuss individual files. You were authorized to accept my signature when I never gave it." Before Paul could respond, two black sedans stopped near the gate. Nathan Caldwell stepped out of the first with his attorney and a project manager. He wore a dark overcoat over his suit and carried no documents. He surveyed the families, the local reporter setting up a camera, and the phones already recording from the sidewalk. "This has gone far enough," he said. Richard moved away from the gate to meet him, then stopped the equipment. Nathan ignored the request and faced the group. "Ladies and gentlemen, no graves are being moved today. This is a preliminary engineering survey. Caldwell Development has followed every permit issued by the city, and any record concerns will be handled through the proper process." Mr. Lewis held up the consent form bearing his late wife's name. "Your proper process says a woman signed this 2 years after she died." Nathan looked toward one of his attorneys. "We are reviewing all claims." Annie stepped forward. "The notice for my mother's grave went to an old address. When it came back, someone signed my grandmother's name." Nathan's attention settled on her. "Young lady, I understand this is emotional, but this is a legal and business matter. Let the adults handle it." Annie kept one hand around Grace's Bible. "My mother spent her life cleaning up after people who thought they were more important than her. You will not erase her now." Several families moved closer, not around Annie, but beside her. Nathan's expression tightened. He turned to Richard. "We need to speak privately." They walked several yards away, though not far enough to escape the cameras. Nathan lowered his voice. "I can resolve this today." "How?" "We adjust the corridor around Emily's plot. Her marker remains where it is. And Grace? We relocate her properly. Caldwell pays every expense, adds a family settlement, and funds maintenance for the new section." Richard looked past him. Annie was helping Ruth adjust the scarf at her neck. Grace asked to be placed beside Emily. "People request many things. Property conditions change. That request was honored, and now circumstances require another arrangement." Richard's voice remained level. "You think Emily matters because she was my wife, and Grace can be moved because her family has less power. I think we can preserve the grave that concerns you personally and compensate the other family generously. That is the problem." Nathan glanced toward the reporter. "Do not turn this into a moral performance. Yesterday you didn't know Grace Carter's name. You're right. And now you're willing to risk hundreds of millions over her burial plot?" "No, I'm willing to risk it because your company forged consent and expected no one to ask questions." "You cannot prove Caldwell ordered anyone to forge anything." "Then help us find out. Stop the work." Nathan shook his head. "Delays destroy leverage. If we pause every time someone disputes a form, this project dies." Richard looked toward the two adjacent graves beyond the trees. "Grace stayed with Emily when I did not. Her grave matters as much as Emily's." Nathan studied him, then gave a small nod as though a decision had been made. "You've allowed guilt to replace judgment." "No, guilt kept me silent for years. Judgment is what brought me here." Nathan returned to the gate and spoke to Paul. "Proceed within the limits of the permit." Paul signaled the operators. The excavator began moving along the service road. The families did not rush the machine. Reverend Brooks opened the gate after the guard unhooked the chain for the work crew, and the attorney reminded everyone to stay on the path. Annie walked first toward Block B, holding Ruth's arm. Richard followed, then Linda, Mrs. Bell, Mr. Lewis, and the other families. By the time the excavator reached the edge of the 7th row, people had formed a line several yards in front of the graves. Annie stood between Grace's marker and the machine. Ruth stood beside her, leaning on her cane but refusing the folding chair Mrs. Bell carried. Paul raised his voice. "You are inside an active survey area. You need to step back," Annie answered, "not until the court reviews the signatures." A police cruiser entered the cemetery. 2 officers approached the group and spoke first with Caldwell's attorney, then with the family's lawyer. One officer addressed Richard. "The permit appears valid. If the property manager requests removal, we may have to clear the marked area." Richard nodded. "I understand." Nathan moved closer. "You still have time to end this." Richard took his place beside Annie. "You could lose control of your company," Nathan said. "Then today I lose it standing where I should have stood years ago." The other families tightened the line. No one shouted. No one touched the equipment. Reverend Brooks began reading the names written on the disputed consent forms, one at a time. Grace Carter, Eleanor Lewis, James Parker, Dorothy May Collins. With each name, a relative answered, "Present." The excavator stopped. Its engine continued running, but the operator removed his hands from the controls. Linda's phone rang. She answered, listened, and walked quickly toward the attorney. "The judge has reviewed the emergency request," she said. "A temporary order has been issued. All survey activity in Block B is suspended until the consent records are examined." The family's attorney raised the signed order. Nathan's face did not change, but Paul signaled the operator to shut down the engine. When the noise ended, Ruth looked at the 2 graves and tightened her hand around Annie's. "This only saves them for today," Annie said. Richard heard her. "Then today is where we begin." The temporary order changed the mood at Pine Hill, but it did not end the conflict. The excavator remained near Block B while Caldwell's attorneys read the judge's instructions. Survey equipment had to be removed from the marked corridor. All disputed records had to be preserved, and no work could resume until the court reviewed the notification process. Nathan stepped away from the families and called someone from his legal team. Paul Mercer directed the operators to load their equipment, though he avoided looking toward Ruth or Annie. The local reporter approached Linda. "Do you have evidence that the signatures were forged?" "We have evidence that several families deny signing the forms," Linda replied. "A formal examination will determine the rest." "Did Whitmore Holdings know about the disputed records?" "No." Nathan ended his call and turned toward them. "That statement is premature." Linda faced him. "Which part?" "The implication that Caldwell did anything improper. We hired a licensed compliance contractor. If an individual employee failed to follow procedure, the company will address it." Mr. Lewis raised the form bearing his late wife's name. "An individual employee brought my wife back from the dead long enough to sign this?" Nathan did not answer him. The reporter moved closer. "Mr. Caldwell, will you release the original consent records? Our attorneys will comply with any lawful request." "That means no," Annie said. Nathan looked at her. "It means we follow the legal process." Annie stood beside Grace's marker, one hand resting on her mother's Bible. "The process only mattered to you after we found out." Richard saw Nathan prepare another dismissive response and stepped between them. She asked a fair question. Nathan turned on him. "You have done enough." "No. I approved financing for a project without examining the people it would affect." "I have not done nearly enough." The reporter lifted her microphone. "Mr. Whitmore, are you saying your company shares responsibility?" Richard could have referred her to legal counsel. Linda would have preferred that. The board would demand it. He looked at Emily Stone, then at Grace's. "Yes." Linda's expression changed, but she did not interrupt. Richard continued. "Whitmore Holdings did not prepare the consent forms, but we financed part of the project. I relied on summaries. I accepted assurances. I did not ask why the least expensive road passed through graves when another route crossed vacant land." Nathan walked toward him. "You are discussing confidential planning documents. The western route adds $4 million in drainage and grading. That is why your engineers rejected it. That is one factor among many. It is the factor written in the file." Cameras shifted toward Nathan. Richard faced the reporter again. "My company benefited from a process that treated families as paperwork. Whether I knew every detail does not remove my responsibility for failing to ask." Nathan's attorney whispered to him, but Nathan ignored the advice. "You're using a private failure from your past to make a public display," he said. "Tell them why this grave matters to you." Richard knew what Nathan expected. If Emily became the center of the story, Grace and the other families could be pushed aside. The dispute would become one wealthy man's grief rather than a pattern of ignored notices and false signatures. Richard spoke before Nathan could control the explanation. "Emily Whitmore was my first wife. I left her when she became ill." Annie lowered her eyes toward the Bible. "I told myself work required everything I had," Richard continued. "I sent money and called that care. Grace Carter worked long shifts, raised her daughter, helped her mother, and still made time to sit with Emily when I would not." The reporter asked, "Did you know Mrs. Carter?" "Not while she was alive." Richard looked at Ruth. "That is part of what I failed to do." He turned toward the camera. "I spent years believing success could bury what I had done, but the dead do not disappear because the living refuse to look at them." No one applauded. Richard was grateful. The admission did not deserve applause. Nathan gave a short laugh. "So this is guilt." "It began with guilt," Richard said. "It continues with evidence." Linda received a message on her tablet. She read it, then handed the device to the family's attorney. "We found the original route analysis," she said. "It includes instructions from David Sloan to remove the western option from the presentation because it would weaken the cost argument for crossing Pine Hill." Nathan's attorney stepped forward. "Where did that document come from?" "Whitmore Holdings Project Archive. You have no authority to release internal correspondence. The court's preservation order gives counsel authority to identify relevant records." Linda opened another file. "There is also an email from Southern Land Compliance, asking whether returned notices should delay the project." Sloan answered, "Resolve the files and maintain schedule." Nathan's face tightened. "That does not instruct anyone to create signatures." "No," Linda said. "It instructs investigators where to begin." The attorney representing the families announced that copies would be delivered to the court and the Alabama Attorney General's office. Until the records were examined, the temporary order would remain in effect. Nathan turned toward the waiting cameras. "Caldwell Development will cooperate fully. We will not accept conclusions based on incomplete documents." Annie walked from Grace's grave to the edge of the path. "My mother cleaned hospital sheets and office floors," she said. "She never had a company, a building, or people waiting to answer her calls. But when someone needed her, she came." Nathan glanced toward his car. Annie continued, "You think poor people leave nothing behind because they don't own buildings. My mother left people." Ruth reached for her hand. Mr. Lewis stood beside them, followed by the other families. They did not need to speak. Their presence answered for every name Caldwell had expected to remain inside a file. The equipment trucks began leaving Pine Hill. Paul Mercer removed the temporary closure notice from the gate, under instruction from the cemetery manager. The orange stakes remained for the court-appointed surveyor to document, but no worker touched the ground near Block B. Richard watched Nathan enter his sedan. "This isn't over," Nathan said through the open door. "No," Richard replied, "it isn't." When the cars were gone, the reporter asked Annie whether she considered the order a victory. Annie looked toward Grace and Emily. "It means the machines stopped today. A victory is when no family has to come here and discover someone signed away a grave for them." Reverend Brooks joined her. "Justice rarely returns what was taken." Ruth nodded. "But it can stop the taking." Richard remained near the path while the families began gathering their chairs and papers. He had lost Nathan's partnership, placed his position at risk, and opened his company to investigation. None of that repaired Emily's final months or gave Grace the thanks she should have received. Annie approached him before leaving. "What happens now?" "The court examines the forms. The state reviews the emails. The families choose their lawyers. My company releases every record." "And the road?" Richard looked at the orange line near the graves. "If the project survives, it goes around Pine Hill. Even if it costs more?" "Yes." Annie held his gaze. That answer should have been easy from the beginning. "It should have been." She returned to Ruth. Richard walked to Emily's marker and placed the opened letter beneath his hand. He did not ask for forgiveness. He understood now that one public confession could not settle years of absence. The machines had stopped. The cameras would leave. His real answer would be measured by what he did after both were gone. 6 months after the machines left Pine Hill, the court released its findings. 11 relocation forms had been falsified. 4 others contained signatures collected without a clear explanation of what the families were approving. Returned notices had been marked as resolved even when no relative had been reached. The western route had been removed from the final presentation because it cost more, not because it was unworkable. Caldwell Development lost its permits. State investigators filed charges connected to document fraud and obstruction of the review. Nathan Caldwell stepped down while the case moved through court, though his attorneys continued to deny that he had ordered anyone to create false signatures. The city rejected the original road proposal. When another developer later submitted a revised plan, the access road curved around Pine Hill and crossed the vacant western land. It cost more. This time, no one at the public hearing apologized for that. Pine Hill received protected historical status before the end of winter. Every marker was photographed and recorded. Families received copies of burial maps, and the cemetery could no longer relocate a grave without verified consent and a public review. Whitmore Holdings also paid a price. Several investors withdrew. 2 board members resigned, accusing Richard of placing personal guilt ahead of shareholder interests. The company's value dropped, and newspapers that once praised his judgment began questioning how many other decisions he had approved without reading beyond the summaries. Richard did not complain. At a board meeting in January, one director asked whether he regretted stopping the project. "I regret that it took a forged signature and a young woman with flowers to make me examine it," he said. Stopping it was the easiest decision in the entire matter. He remained CEO, though the board placed new restrictions on major land deals. Every future project had to include independent community review, and summaries could no longer replace the original impact reports. Linda called the changes expensive and overdue. Richard agreed with both descriptions. The legal fund he created remained outside his control. Annie, Ruth, Reverend Brooks, and representatives from the affected families selected its advisors. They chose to use the money for cemetery preservation, legal assistance, home care support, and transportation for people who could not reach Pine Hill on their own. Richard offered to cover Annie's college tuition. She refused. "I asked for a bus," she reminded him, "not a new life." He accepted her answer. Instead, the fund created a scholarship open to graduates from several Birmingham neighborhoods. Annie submitted an application like everyone else. Her name was removed before the committee reviewed it, and she earned one of the first awards. She continued working weekends at the bakery while attending community college. Ruth told everyone at New Hope that Annie studied too late, worked too much, and never carried enough cash for lunch. Annie told them Ruth exaggerated. Mrs. Bell confirmed that Ruth did not. Richard visited Pine Hill most Sunday afternoons. He did not send workers. He drove himself, brought a small bucket and cleaning cloths, and cleared weeds around Emily's marker. He also helped photograph stones, whose names had begun fading. Some Sundays, families spoke to him. Other Sundays, they did not. He learned not to expect gratitude. Once a month, he stopped at Ruth's apartment afterward. Mrs. Bell usually found a reason to enter at the same time, claiming she needed to return a bowl or borrow sugar. Richard knew she was checking on Ruth and evaluating him. During his 3rd visit, Ruth served him cornbread and coffee. He thanked her and said he was sorry again for what had happened to Emily and Grace. Ruth placed her cup on the table. "A sorry means little, if it only visits once." Richard nodded. "Then I'll keep visiting. We'll see." She did not offer forgiveness for Emily. She did not claim Grace would have approved of him. She spoke about the women as people, not lessons created for his improvement. Richard listened. Through Ruth, he learned that Grace sang off-key in church, kept peppermint candy in every coat pocket, and once argued with a grocery manager for 20 minutes after he overcharged an elderly customer by $3. He learned Emily had sometimes laughed so hard at Grace's stories that she had to set down her tea. Those details gave Richard more pain than the grave had. They also gave Emily back parts of her life that his absence had hidden from him. 1 year after Annie first approached him outside the bus station, the Pine Hill Community Memorial Route began weekend service. The bus did not carry Richard's name. That had been Annie's condition. Its first trip left Birmingham shortly after 9 on a clear fall morning. Several passengers carried flowers. Others held framed photographs, small flags, or bags containing cloths and water for cleaning markers. Annie sat beside Ruth near the front. Ruth wore her navy church dress and held her cane between both hands. You could have worn something more comfortable, Annie said. I dress properly for the cemetery. Mom would say the dead don't inspect clothes. Your mother said many things when she didn't want to iron. Annie laughed and rested her head briefly against Ruth's shoulder. The bus followed the route Annie had once forgotten. It passed the old transfer point, continued south, and turned onto Pine Hill Road. There was no 2-mile walk from the final stop now. The new route entered a paved turnaround near the cemetery gate. Richard was already there. He wore a plain coat and stood near Block B without an assistant, driver, or camera crew. He had brought a small arrangement for Emily but had not placed it yet. Annie stepped down from the bus carrying 2 bouquets of white daisies. Ruth followed with help from the driver. Richard approached but allowed Annie to set their pace. Good morning, Mrs. Carter. Ruth nodded. You came early. I didn't want you waiting. That's an improvement. They walked together to the 7th row. Annie placed 1 bouquet at Grace's marker and arranged the stems until the flowers rested evenly. She carried the other bouquet to Emily. Richard stood several feet away. Annie looked at him. You can help. He knelt and held the flowers while she removed the plastic. Together, they placed the daisies beneath Emily's name. Ruth sat on the stone bench and opened Grace's old Bible. Other passengers moved among the rows, calling greetings to one another and tending to graves that had gone too long without visitors. Annie looked toward the bus near the gate, then back at Richard. You found your way back? Richard considered the 2 women resting side by side, the bus that had brought families directly to the cemetery, and the people moving along paths once marked for removal. No, he said. You showed me the way. Annie did not answer with forgiveness. She simply handed him the cloth for Emily's marker and began cleaning Grace's. Richard worked beside her. Some people spend their lives building roads that carry their own names. But sometimes the most important road begins when a person finally stops long enough to help a stranger find the way. This story reminds us that true wealth is not measured by money, status, or the size of what we build, but by the way we treat people when they have nothing to offer us in return. Richard cannot undo the years he abandoned Emily. Yet he learns that regret only has meaning when it leads to responsibility and lasting action. Annie and Grace show that kindness, loyalty, and courage can leave a deeper legacy than any building. Justice may not restore what was lost, but it can protect others from suffering the same wrong. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.